I'm thinking about Joe Rogan, and I'm thinking about podcasts in general, and like what it is about the sort of current era of podcasting that has found itself so easily appropriatable by the right. In other words, like, why is there so much right-wing sentiment dominating the podcast space? And I don't necessarily mean like right-wing politics, like right-wing political influencers, but rather the influence of people like that, the talking points and the sort of baseline sentiments that people throw out there casually. You've got a lot of the red pill content. You've got a lot of, even video game content, obviously, that like discusses, female characters and woke, whatever. You just have a lot of that sort of right-leaning type of sentiment when it comes to podcasts as a general format and the space of it, right? It seems kind of dominated by, I don't want to say right-wing ideology. I'll say right-wing sentiment. That feels better. And there's been some, a lot of like speculation about this and sort of attempting to diagnose this problem since the loss of the Democrats and Kamala Harris, because it's pretty clear that this influence of podcasters, this network of podcasters that's been growing for a while, including Joe Rogan, is very influential. And Trump was going on some of these podcasts in order to bolster his campaign, and that seems to have he seems to have been rewarded for that. And on top of that, especially when it comes to this sort of like red pill masculinity type of podcasting, it's really easy for him to play into that. That's a whole audience that's really ripe for radicalization of any kind. Like there's kind of a wash in these right-wing sentiments and these like traditionalist, ultra masculine type of talking points about women, and even to things as basic as a woman can't lead the country because she's a woman. You get a lot of that from these podcasters, and so all Trump has to do is go on that podcast and say, well, that's why you should vote for me, right? Just play into that type of narrative a little bit, that sort of masculinity thing, and that's going to activate those audience members. And there's been some discussion about, whether the left needs a Joe Rogan, which I think is kind of stupid and misses the point. I've said that on this podcast before. So I'm not so much going to talk about that, like whether I feel like there needs to be a left-wing equivalent to what is happening on the right, but more so like why I think that's happening and how I think it's actually sort of a new form of political correctness that we're seeing that is actually dragging the politics of this country in general to the right, which is something that I've been talking about for a while, where, it's kind of this like gradual effect that you see partially as a result of the Trump administration and as a result of the media efforts against Trump and his administration and his campaigns. The backfire from that has caused a lot of people to drift to the right. And so in the defeat of those types of narratives and, trying to paint a pretty honest picture of Donald Trump, but still a negative picture of Donald Trump, people have become even more cynical about those types of narratives. Trump has become normalized, essentially. And that form of politics has become normalized to the point where talking about mass deportations is actually something that sounds viable to people now. Whereas when Trump was first getting elected, everyone was panicking about the idea of the wall. But we've been kind of demoralized when it comes to these pretty far-right policies. And so I think that the podcasts are both a victim and a progenitor of that. And I'm talking mostly about like comedy podcasts, like Joe Rogan. You see it with Andrew Schulz now. You see it a little bit sometimes with like Bert and Tom Segura. You see it with Ian Fidance, who is one of my favorite podcasters. I like the B and Ian podcast with Jordan. But for a long time now, Ian has had like pretty consistent right-wing sentiments that he airs out on his podcast. And you get a lot of that from comedians. I think it's a natural direction for a lot of these comedians to drift in. And I want to talk about why. Because basically, the best example I think is Joe Rogan. And I think what you see with Joe Rogan is there's an incentive that comes with podcasting or kind of proliferation of any type of content in general. And I feel this pressure too. That's partially why I want to talk about this, because it's kind of like talking about what type of patterns you start to notice when you do a project like this, where you're talking about right-wing figures, you're talking about right-wing politics, but not directly supporting or endorsing right-wing politics. So it creates a different effect where, I reach some of that audience. I've probably reached some of that audience with this video. But I'm not directly feeding into those narratives either. But there's a lot of insight that you get about like what the algorithm does. It's much easier to find people on the right through the YouTube algorithm. Much easier. And I don't really know what that is. I think it's a matter of behavior. Personality differences between people on the right and people on the left. People on the right are a little bit more engaged. They're a little bit more angry, for lack of a better word, in general. Not everyone on the right, but a lot of people on the right. That's part of what fuels a right-wing politic, and it's also part of what fuels engagement on a platform like YouTube, comments and that sort of thing. So people see narratives that they disagree with and they get upset about it and they comment about it. Or you see a narrative that you agree with and you get excited about it. And so what I've noticed through the YouTube algorithm is that there is an incentive to kind of to drift in that direction. And the thing that keeps me from doing that is the fact that I disagree with those politics. I have a firm disagreement with most, if not all, right-wing policies. And so that keeps me grounded. But a lot of people don't actually have that. And a lot of people don't really examine politics in general and the conversations surrounding politics to the extent that they get an idea of what they really believe on a deeper level or don't. And obviously these things evolve over time, and that's the case with me as well. But when you examine politics through a certain lens, you recognize, especially as things become more radicalized, you kind of have to pick a side, right? Like the term fence sitter exists for a reason. That comes from the Civil War, being somebody who refused to pick a side in the war. And so this idea of being a centrist, I'm somewhere in the middle. I agree with some and some, I think that that's less and less a viable position to take. And I understand why people want to do it, because the idea of picking a side makes everything seem so much more combative. It makes it seem like we're being polarized and pulled apart into this kind of culture war. And to an extent, that's true. But you also got to recognize that based on where our politics are right now, saying I'm in the middle, that puts you center right at best. Like, this is not a left-leaning country right now if we're talking about the government and the actual politics that are going through. Even on the Democratic side, you don't have left-wing policies that are happening right now. Maybe on a granular level in some cases, and you can point to people like Tim Walz in Minnesota who enacted some pretty progressive legislation in a pretty practical way. But that's not what we're seeing on a federal level. That's not what Biden's administration has done. It started doing that to an extent, but then people like Manchin killed it. So that's not the type of politics that we're getting from the Democratic Party. We're getting centrist politics from the Democratic Party. And not only has that placed the Democratic Party, in my opinion, pretty firmly in the right-leaning position, but it's also kind of destroyed the Democratic Party because they're not offering anything to the base of people that they need to get excited about their policies. And so, you see this kind of pulling of the entire country to the right. And I think it's because of, really, if you think about it, it's political correctness. That whole thing of I'm not at one side or the other. Listen, I'm not political like that. I don't consider myself a this or that. That's fine. Again, I get why people say that and think that way. It makes sense. I relate to it. But the problem is, by refusing to pick a side, by being so politically correct that you don't want to choose how you identify in terms of these different politics that are pulling at our country, there's nothing we can do about it at this point. Like, Donald Trump and his cohort are pulling this country far to the right. And so you either support that or you don't, in my view. And because kind of supporting it, it's going to land you to the right. Maybe not as far right as Donald Trump, but it's going to allow him to do the far right things that he wants to do. And it's going to put you in a position where you're only slightly to the left of that. And so, you know, I don't want this country to be as polarized as it is, but I think it's pretty common sense that the center position is like, you know, everybody should have healthcare. We should have a healthcare system that works. We don't. That's why most people agree with this Luigi Mangione kid who, you know, murdered a guy in broad daylight. And it's like you have people on the left and right that are on a base level saying like, yeah, I agree with what that guy did. Wouldn't do it myself, wouldn't condone it, but I agree with him. I see why he did it, and I relate to it, and it kind of makes me happy that he did it. Right? That's crazy that people feel that way about a murder, but it's because in general, people agree with the idea that our healthcare system's fucked up, and it's fucked up because of the people who profit from it, like leeches. And so we should just do away with that. And we should have a healthcare system that's not for profit. So for a lot of people, that's a crazy, radical left-wing position, but it's not. That's the center. That's the center. But if you look at the center of our politics right now, it's dragged so far away from that to the point that Democrats would not even consider that. Democrats do not consider that. Biden basically ran on that position and then stopped talking about it immediately. And you could give him the credit to say he would have been pushing for more things like that, except for the fact that he essentially capitulated to Manchin and Sinema and decided that there was nothing that he could do to push them to the left. And so he allowed them to push us all, every single one of us in this entire country, to the right. And so back to the podcasting issue is that you have these commentators with huge audiences, and they talk to so many people, many voters. Some of these people are political, some of them are completely apolitical, but they take this politically correct position of, oh, I'm in the middle. And yeah, I got a lot of Trump supporters in my audience, so I don't want to come out blatantly against Trump. Jordan Jensen, Ian Fidance's co-host, recently posted, I don't know, a podcast where she was talking about the fact that she voted for Kamala. And this is a person who has like espoused a fair amount of sort of right-wing rhetoric, right-wing culture war rhetoric herself over the past several years. But now I think she's kind of had a change of heart, and she is realizing that she doesn't really agree with these sort of far-right radical types. And so, you know, she's kind of expressing that sentiment, not really, not in any combative way, but you see people in the comments who are saying, oh, it's such a shame that Jordan Jensen is a Kamala Harris voter. And it's like, that I'm sure creates pressure on her to not say things that indicate that, because she has a fair amount of people in her audience that are Trump supporter because she has refused to pick a side at any point up until now. And, you know, there's a lot of people in this country that support Trump, and I don't think they should all be, you know, disappeared. But I just think that there's way too much normalization of those ideas, because those ideas are not normal. Talking about mass deportations of any kind, I don't care if you're talking about illegal immigrants, that's not normal. Mass deportations is a horrific policy. It's going to go so badly. There's no way to do something like that in a way that is not a horrific crime against humanity. This is the reason why people view fascism as bad and a third rail and something that we should never ever do again. Because when people start talking about stuff like mass deportations, it becomes an ugly, ugly mess. And so, you know, I think people like Joe Rogan and others like him, people in the Rogan sphere, as they call it, have kind of facilitated that environment. And I guess, you know, if I want people to take anything away from this, it's to get away from this idea that like, oh, centrism, I don't agree with Democrats or Republicans. I'm not saying you have to be a Democrat. I'm not saying you have to pick, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. But identify where your politics fall. Are you on the right or are you not? And it's okay to have some mixed views. I agree with some things here and some things there. But know what those are. And recognize, too, that, like, there's only so much splitting the difference that you can do. Not because it's not okay to believe in gun rights and also universal health care. There's millions of people in this country that feel that exact way. That's a viable policy position. But the problem is, if you allow that position to make you support Republicans because, say, Democrats are not offering any healthcare solutions, although Republicans aren't either, but at least they kind of pretend to, right? Just understand that if you vote for Republicans while you're in that sort of centrist position, you are pushing this country to the right, baby. Far to the right. And if you don't want that, then you've got to vote for left-wing policies, man. You got to vote whether it's fucking Democrats or Jill Stein or whatever. Preferably Democrats at this point. Hopefully some kind of third party emerges in the next few years that is actually viable. But for now, they're not viable. And so, you know, if there's Democrats that offer left-wing policies and we want to push this country more to a sensible center where things like universal health care are not completely unthinkable, then we gotta vote to the left, and we gotta push things to the left, because it's not just about voting either, you know? Because Democrats have proven that they are bad at acting on the things that we vote for them to do. So I'm not saying voting is the solution, but I'm saying that if you have left-wing sentiments, then stand on that, and don't be fucking afraid to go against the grain of this Trump administration, because they're dragging this country to the far right, man. And, you know, I don't care if you agree with every Democrat or you agree with every liberal or you agree with every leftist. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that we have to reclaim this country a little bit with a sensible politic. And people like Joe Rogan, you know, they're not going to do it for us because they are incentivized to not think very hard about why they believe what they believe. They're incentivized to sort of let the algorithm dictate it. And that's why I think that you've seen Joe Rogan, you know, turn into the right-wing figure that he has, because he sort of refused to take a position for long enough, or at least refused to firmly take a position for long enough that he has been kind of dragged to the right by the various algorithms that we're all exposed to, whether it's the algorithm of news we see on Twitter, or it's the algorithm of the content that we post on YouTube, or the algorithm of the content that we consume from YouTube. If you're engaging with all of that stuff mindlessly, and you're not thinking about what direction it's pulling you in the left or right spectrum, I know it's annoying to think about politics in terms of left and right. That feels stupid. But it's important that we recognize things in that spectrum right now. And, you know, if your media diet or your media output that you make money from is pulling you in a certain direction, you got to be aware of that and make sure you stand on that. And, you know, Joe Rogan increasingly stands behind the right-wing positions that he purports. For a long time, he didn't. Now he does. And you see the same thing with a lot of these comics. But they're not willing to say they're right-wing. They're too politically correct to say they're right-wing, because they would lose a lot of audience if they said that too. If they said they were left-wing, they would lose audience. If they said they were right-wing, they would lose audience. So they play it to the middle, to all of our detriment, because all of us are being appropriated by a form of politics that we aren't fully comprehending, which is this right-wing sort of neoliberal form of politics. And what I mean by neoliberal is that even the liberals, even the Democrats, are serving the same type of politics that are dragging the country to the right. They're serving the same corporate interests that are dragging the country to the right. That's a problem.